we're going to be recording the meeting. Please do keep your microphones muted and your camera switched off. But please do use the chat if you want to ask us any questions or make any points. We really welcome your contributions, so do take part. Shall we have the next slide? I'm Maggie Rosario and I'm chair of the East of England Psychological Professions Network. And Anna?
Hi everybody, I am Anna. I'm a senior assistant psychologist working in the East of England PPN with Maggie and Lara.
And Lara, do go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Lara. I'm a senior assistant psychologist working in the East of England PPN, and I'm also a psychological wellbeing practitioner working for the Talking Therapies digital team.
Thanks, Lara. Shall we have the next slide? And this is just to tell you we have a really brilliant steering group who have contributed a lot to this evening. So do please email us if you would like to join the steering group. They really play a very valuable part in helping us think about these sessions. And it's a really good experience for them as well. So if you'd like to join the steering group, let us know. Shall we have the next slide? Anna, you're going to talk us through the ground rules, aren't you?
Yes, I am. So just before we start the webinar today, so as you may have noticed, this webinar is being recorded. So we do ask everyone to keep their cameras switched off and their microphones on mute, but we super encourage any interaction via the chat function. So please type in your questions or comments and we will type back to you as quickly as we can. We've also got time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, so we will be able to hopefully answer many of your questions then. We do want this to be as safe a space as possible, so please bear that in mind when you are asking your questions to try and make sure that we keep that safe, confidential space here within our webinar today. We do want to make sure it's non-judgmental and non-pressurised for everybody attending, and it can be as supportive as possible. And as mentioned already, please put all your questions into the chat function as they pop up in your mind.
Thanks very much, Anna. So we're now going to, I hope that we have Anna Lee with us from the British Psychological Society. Are you here? Anna Lee, are you here? Oh, it sounds like maybe she's not. Shall we move on? And perhaps she'll join us in a bit.
Yeah, I'll just move on to talk about the themes for the session then, and then we can always come back after this section.
Thank you, that's great.
So we mentioned earlier how our steering group worked with us to come up with ideas for the meetings, along with your feedback from previous sessions as well. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the questions that we asked them to determine the content for the session. So we looked at the two main questions here. So the first one, what questions might you have when applying for a job in the psychological professions? And the second question, if you were to attend a talk on how to write job applications, what information would you find helpful to be included? So you had lots of feedback and ideas, as you can see from all of the bullet points here. So I won't go through all of the bullet points now. I'll just summarise the main themes. So in response to the first question here, the themes were around equality, diversity and inclusion. So there were things like support for wellbeing, information about reasonable adjustments, and then work-life balance. Would the role be fully remote, hybrid, face-to-face? How flexible are the hours? And what are the day-to-day aspects of the role? And then moving on from that, there was a lot of points around day-to-day aspects and experience. So how the role sits within the team, the service and the organisation, how much clinical work versus how much admin aspects, development opportunities. So you can see there's a lot of points here. I think particularly because when you look at a job spec on paper, it can be quite hard to visualise what that role might look like day to day and how it fits. And then finally, a point on finances. So if that role involves an NHS funded course, how long do you have to wait after qualifying to apply for another NHS funded role as well? So looking at the second question, so again, we identified a lot of themes here with the equality, diversity and inclusion theme, declaring disabilities and reasonable adjustments, structure and content, some points around the additional information section on an application form. So how to meet the person spec, how much to write and what to include, and then some general tips. So tips about how to write about transferable skills, common pitfalls on applications, and highlighting relevant experiences. And then some points on processes. So what is the application process and what are the timescales and how to get updates on that application process. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Maggie to talk us through the application form structure and the process, or we might just loop back to that other slide. I'll see what you want to do, Maggie.
I'm happy to go forward, and I think one of the things that I will say is that we will make this recording available, so if people want to go back and look at your slides in their own time and see the kinds of questions that our steering group came up with when thinking about applying for a job, they will be able to do that, won't they?
Yeah, so, that's right. You'll be able to have a look at those bullet points because there's quite a lot of information there. So you can have a look at it in more detail on the recording. Thanks, Maggie.
So let's think together about the application form. Remember to put any questions or points that you want to make in the chat as we go through, and then we can answer them at the end. So could we have the next slide, Lara? So personal details. Make sure you fill in your details correctly so that you can be contacted. Now, most trusts shortlist candidates anonymously, so without being able to access these details. So when we're shortlisting, we mostly don't know the names or addresses, the dates of birth. We don't know your gender, your ethnicity. We don't know anything about your personal details. This information only becomes available to us after we've shortlisted. Shall we have the next slide, Lara? So that just gives you an idea of the sections of an application form. And the next slide. So your qualifications. For early career roles, so when you're starting out in your career, I would go back to GCSEs and A-levels and include them. So one of the questions we often have is, how far should we go back? So I would go back to GCSEs. Follow any guidance that you're given about the order that you should present this information in. For example, should you present the most recent first and then go backwards in time? You may get a hint of what the shortlisters want you to do. Be logical and systematic. Don't be scattergun in your approach. Your application form provides a window into your organisational skills. Show how well you can do it. Shall we have the next slide? Okay, so this is about employment history. Your employment history gives employers an idea of the experiences that you've had and what you might bring to the role. We're really interested in knowing how long you did a role for, how many hours or days a week. List all the roles that you think are relevant. Again, follow any guidance given and be systematic and logical. Don't just jump around. Be sure to fill in the start and finish dates. You'd be surprised how often these aren't filled in, so that the shortlister knows which jobs are ongoing and which are previous roles. If you've had any gaps in your employment, explain them. For example, if you went travelling. When you're asked to list the duties of a role, don't just copy out your current job role and person specification. Try to bring the roles to life so that the shortlister can gain a sense of what the job entails. What skills, knowledge and experience might you have gained through the roles that you've done? Bear the person's specification of the role that you're applying for in mind. Shall we have the next slide? Supporting information. This is the most obvious place for you to prove why you're worth interviewing. Show why you're applying for this role in particular, why you want to work for this organisation especially, how you're suited to this specific role, and what you will bring to this role that will be an asset to the service and to the organisation. It's not just about how you can benefit from being successful. Employers want to know how it will help them to employ you. Try to put yourself in their shoes and imagine you have many people to choose from. What will you bring that others may not? Next slide. Pay particular attention to the roles and responsibilities of the job that you're applying for. What can they tell you about what the employer is looking for? The main focus of your personal statement should be showing how you meet the essential criteria for the role that you're applying for. You can find this out by looking at the person specification on the right-hand side of this page here, which lists the essential and desirable criteria in a range of areas. Thank you. Shall we move on? Ideally, your references would be from your current or most recent employer. If this is your first job, you can use a university lecturer or tutor, or ideally someone who's familiar with your work who can comment on your abilities. What happens when you click submit? Once you've submitted your application and the post is closed, your application goes through for shortlisting. So shortlisting involves scoring each candidate against the person specification. Does the applicant meet the essential criteria fully or partially or not at all? In our trust, we have at least 2 shortlisters who each score the candidates separately, and then the scores are reviewed together and the highest scoring candidates are invited for interview. We sometimes have more than 100 applicants for a role, so it's important that the application form is logically organised, clearly written and easy to read. We're now going to hear from 2 really experienced shortlisters. They were unable to be here because they're both on leave, but they both care so deeply about this that they've made recordings for us to share so that you can hear about their experiences and benefit from their advice to you.
Hi Maggie, I'm Jessie Carter. I'm a senior psychotherapist. I've formerly trained as an art therapist and I've also done my EMDR training. I've sat on interview panels and been an interviewee a lot of times, but some of the information that I hope to impart will help to make a successful application. So at least you get through the first door, and that is the key.
Absolutely. So let's start with the first question. What do you think makes for a strong application? What are you looking for when you read an application form?
So what always comes through when you're looking through an application form is evidence that the candidate has read the job description and the personal spec as shown, and that they've answered them very specifically. So the things that really stand out is making it easy to read. Don't make it tricky. Don't have really long paragraphs. Don't be frightened to use short sentences. It's not a comprehension test. It's really helpful to read the core values of the trust that you're applying for. Have a little look and draw out some words that they use and begin to think about where you might slot them in, because that shows that not only have you taken a bit of trouble to think about the organisation, but that also you're aligned to what they're thinking about. I would also suggest mirroring and copying any words that you can read in their job description, particularly that you can slot into your application form as you go along. That's a really key thing, and it's very clear to see who's done that when they're applying for jobs on an application form.
And as an individual shortlister, are there any things additional that you're looking out for?
So when you're individually trying to shortlist, what's really important is that you answer all of the essential criteria. So on the person spec for any NHS role, but actually any role with an organisation that's looking for specific skills, you need to tell them that you have everything that they have asked for. The best way to do that is to literally answer it in bullet form as they have done on the job spec, and make it really easily laid out, the easier it is to read, the easier it is to shortlist, and we end up going, oh, looking forward to meeting that one. So that's a really key thing. If it says essential criteria, you will need to meet it to be shortlisted. We'll be able to go on to transferable skills later on, but that's a really key thing. I think I've said answer like a comprehension. Just do it. And then if you're able to answer any of the desirable criteria, which will be in a second column next to essential, just pop it underneath. That's a golden, that's like the icing on the cake. We don't seek for desirable in order to interview, but it's wonderful to know that you've got it.
Excellent. And what are the common pitfalls that you see people falling into?
Writing in massive, great big paragraphs, sometimes with no grammar. So you make it really hard for the shortlister to be able to deduce and work out whether you have got the right essential criteria or not. Another key thing is when people mix up. So you will have different sections in the form that will look at values, skills. It's really helpful if you answer the application form in exactly the way it's laid out, so we know exactly where things belong. If you jam it all in one go or mix things up, it makes it a really tough job for us. So just do exactly as it's written. A lower score in an application form, because all application forms are scored according to how closely you meet the criteria and whether you've been able to evidence a sum of the experience that you have that says why you have got the essential criteria. So a lack of evidence will lower your score. If you don't meet all the essential criteria, it's more than likely that you wouldn't be shortlisted unless you're able to show transferable skills. Not adding any additional information to that. So, for example, if it says one of the key skills, essential skills, is that you need to be able to prioritise your caseload and manage this, you need to be able to say, I am competent and able to manage my caseload. This is something I've been practicing for the last 4 or 5 years, or 1 or 2 years, or however long it is. So you can show a little bit of history and evidence as to how you've done that.
Excellent, thank you. Other than what you've talked about so far, is there any particular advice you'd give to people completing application forms?
If there's a phone number on the advert, ring it up. Make time to call and contact the person who is likely to be interviewing and more than likely to be shortlisting, and begin a relationship with them. It might be that you don't fulfill all the essential criteria, but that the person who's overseeing the interview process is creative thinking and is willing to think about transferable skills. But if you've rung them up, not only have you made time to begin something of a working alliance with them, but you've also shown that you're thinking outside of the box. It's a really underrated and underused thing to do, and I would say that's a super important thing. It doesn't mean that we can offer you the job. It doesn't mean that you may even get shortlisted, but it's a really good start. And it's also really helpful to know if you're unsure whether you're going to meet the criteria. It's a really helpful way of just sounding that out without wasting your time or theirs. If you're able to speak to somebody, make a few notes about what they say. Pick out some of the words that they say. Ask them to describe the service, for example. So then you're going into an interview, a potential interview, knowing something about the organisation and or the delivery of the team. I've written, think outside the box. Think about the transferable skills that you've got, and think widely about adverts. When you speak to somebody, you're able to understand a bit more about what other skills you might have that they didn't know they needed. So that is that's a key piece of advice I'd give to anybody. I couldn't think of anything else. Did you think of anything?
No, I think you've covered it beautifully. You talked about bullet points. Is there anything else that you would add when it comes to structuring the supporting information, or have you covered it?
I think the key thing is to go down in the process that they've put it out, because as a shortlister, we just want to be able to tick. That's all we need to do. We don't need lots of information. That's what the interview process is for. But if you're able to lay it out in the way that they have, that's the most straightforward way of doing it. You'll have a box below which is for additional information. You can always stick things that are desirable in there. You might want to let us know about any other skills that you've had, but don't forget, when somebody applies for a job, we've got your history, we've got something about skills and courses that you've done. You can always draw some of that information into the supporting evidence if that's useful. A key thing is not to use up too many words. You get double the amount of words, I think, now on application forms than you used to, and it's notable that people like to fill it. Don't worry about doing that.
Okay, that's a really good tip. And you mentioned earlier transferable skills. Is there anything that we need to say about that here?
Well, I suppose what I would think about in transferable skills is not just looking for jobs that are just strictly aligned to some of the qualifications you have. You might have done some volunteering that might make you a different sort of candidate. You might have experience at home that makes you a different sort of candidate. Thinking outside of the box, which is where the phone call is useful. Transferable skills are really helpful. I would always suggest that if you don't reach the essential criteria for just one part of the form, it's worth saying, I know I don't have this or this qualification, but I do believe I have wholly transferable skills, and then tell us what they are and tell us how you've gained them. In this sort of particular time of life that we're in, we really look for people with diverse and all encapsulating experiences that might not just be academic. So don't hold them back, really sell yourself. You know, we don't know your name. When you come through to shortlisting, we don't know your name, we won't know your age, we won't even know what sex you are. So this is a golden opportunity to make yourself jump off the page, and don't be frightened to use the word transferable skills. Other things that I would say are important are particular words that help define your experience. So we often encourage people to use things like, if you've got solid experience or robust experience, or if you're developing experience, to use some of those words. Use the core values from the trust. And also a key thing is to talk about that you've got capacity, that you're capable and you're able. You know, we all know that when we meet you, but it's really nice to see that actually you think that about yourself too.
Thank you. I think one of the things we haven't talked about is a diverse workforce, and you said something there that kind of jogged my memory about it. But certainly in our organisation, we really welcome people from different backgrounds, different experience, people with neurodiversity. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. And you know what, that's a real bonus to a team, because actually we like a team that mirrors the group of patients that we work with, who are also from all different walks of life, who've also had all different life experiences. They may have diagnoses, they may not, they may be undiagnosed. So actually being able to say that on a form shows that not only have you been able to use your skills to apply for something, but that also we're an open and inclusive team. And when we shortlist, there's no space for anybody to be marginalised. So please do mention that. You don't have to at the same time, although there is a need for us to be able to make reasonable adjustment for people who seek it. If you don't want to declare anything on a form at that point, that's quite all right. But you will have different skills, as you were saying. It's not just what you've learned at university and school. Think of it broadly around these things.
Thank you. Lastly, is there anything that you haven't had a chance to say that feels really important to say, to pass on to people?
Be brave. Don't worry if you don't look like the perfect candidate. Sometimes there might be 5 not perfect candidates, but actually there's something about them all on paper that we want to be able to interview, and you just never know. I would always say, look for jobs that attract you, not just the ones that you're specifically trained for. There might be something about another job that looks really enticing, but you're aware, oh, I haven't got this and this and this. Ring up the person on the advert. Just ask them, would they be willing to look at your application if you applied. You've got nothing to lose.
Thank you. That is lovely. Really appreciated.
Not a problem.
Just good.
Good luck to everyone.
So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight into what we're looking for as shortlisters. So that was Jessie. Now we're going to go on to hear about somebody else who's also very experienced in shortlisting to find out their perspectives. So would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, so my name is Patrick Larson. I'm the Deputy Clinical Lead for the Talking Therapy Service in Mid-Essex, and also the Clinical Lead for the Psychological Therapies for Severe Mental Health Problem Service in Mid-Essex. So in my in both my roles, I'm involved in shortlisting and interviewing candidates for a variety of roles, such as CBT therapists, psychological wellbeing practitioners, and counsellors, amongst others.
Thank you. So what do you think makes for a strong application? What are you as a potential employer looking for when you read an application form?
Well, what you want to see is that there's a clear rationale for why you're applying for the role, and how, I guess, how the role you're applying for relates to your interests, your current interest and experience, and also perhaps how you want to develop as a clinician or in whatever role it might be, but how you want to develop as a professional. I think what's really important to include is clearly linking your experiences, your work experience, and also your training and education to the person's specification that's as part of the job ad, and to make that bit really relevant, because it helps the shortlister identify how you would fit the role that you're applying for. It's really important to have a very clear, structured presentation of the information, so ensuring that kind of providing a rationale for why you're applying for the role, and then linking everything else to your experience and how it relates to the job that you're applying for. We often see people making kind of observations or kind of telling us things that we already know about the services, which I guess is an attempt to show that you're critiquing things, which can be helpful, but be cautious about how you use that. Us working in these services, we do have good knowledge of them. It's more maybe about linking something to your experience, not just making a general observation of the state of primary care, for example, or the NICE guidelines, but kind of linking it to what you might be able to contribute to the service would be more helpful. And of course, really emphasizing kind of sometimes you're moving into roles which are newish, perhaps, or you're moving sideways, perhaps, into another setting. Really highlighting what your transferable skills are. There's always, we do understand that people need to develop. Sometimes there's new things to learn. They're not going to be, the finished item as such. So do emphasize what skills you do have and how they are transferable to the setting you're applying for. We think that's what makes a really strong application.
Are there particular things that you as an individual shortlister look out for?
Yeah, it kind of ties back to the previous question, in that the clearer you make your the relevance of your experience and training and transferable skills, the clearer you make that, the easier it is for us to see it. There has to be relevant, the experience that you have. The training and education has to be relevant, and it has to be clear to us. We can't just assume we can't assume that you have to communicate to us how it's relevant. And if there are kind of bits where you need development, it's okay to emphasize that too, but it still has to be, you still have to fall within the, I guess, within the threshold of being able to do the job that you're applying for. And sometimes we don't see that. Sometimes we see people who try and make a leap into a profession that's too far from where they are at the moment, and you can't shortlist for that. So so the particular things I guess we're looking for is just that clarity of why you're applying for the role, how your experience and training is relevant to it. That's mainly what we look for, and that's presented in a way that's understandable for us.
You mentioned some of the things there, but what pitfalls do people regularly fall into? What are the things that lower their scores in shortlisting?
I guess not relating to the person's specs. We don't get a sense of who they are really. They might express an interest in the work that's done, but they don't show us how they can do the work, or how they can, what can they bring to it that we can understand. So that's kind of how people communicate how they might be suitable for the role. Like I said as well, that gap between your experience and what you're applying for might be too wide. So I guess it's doing an application takes time and effort, to think through. It's a shame that people put a lot of effort into applications where that gap is just too significant. You can't shortlist the person compared to other candidates who might have experience that's a lot closer to the actual role. So that's another pitfall, which means we don't shortlist them. Sometimes the information about the qualifications can be unclear. I think, if you're shortlisting a lot of candidates, we wouldn't necessarily investigate qualifications if you don't always understand them. So do make that clear, as clear as possible for us, and how relevant it is to, how relevant it is to the person spec that's in the job as well. A significant kind of pitfall is personal statements, which can be, quite poorly written, unstructured. They can be full of slightly irrelevant material. It's fine to kind of express some personal interests and things like that, but sometimes they kind of deviate too much from the job that you're applying for. So the message needs to be on target for what you're applying for, because we have to understand who you are and if you're good for this role, or a potential good candidate for this role. So do give some thought to personal statements. One paragraph explaining why you're interested and why you're a good fit is not enough. You won't get shortlisted on that. We need to understand who you are as a person, and your personal statement is your best opportunity to do that. So I would recommend having other people read your personal statements, of course, to ensure that the language is correct and everything, and that it makes sense essentially. I think sometimes people use templates for jobs. Do be careful with that, because you sometimes forget to change information, and if you're essentially applying for another role, you won't get shortlisted, even if you do have good experience. We want to see that you've put some effort into what you're applying for.
And is there any guidance about how people should structure their personal statements? Is there anything you want to add about that?
I guess it's like I said before, it's start off with expressing why you're interested in the setting. Show some do you have a good understanding of the setting that you're applying for. If you're applying for a talking therapies role, as a trainee role, explain to us kind of why you want to do that, because there's lots of other roles you can apply for. So why this one? So do highlight that. It does make the application more appealing. It shows that you've shown an interest in what you're applying for. So kind of start with that, and then perhaps move on to things like, how's your experience relevant for this role? And how, start with the experience, perhaps then different settings you worked in, and how, and include how your skills are transferable as well. Yeah, so even if it's you've worked in an inpatient setting, for example, what skills did you learn in the inpatient setting that could be helpful for a primary care setting? Highlight them to us. And then follow it maybe by your education and training and how that's relevant, and highlight the transferable skills. Do demonstrate as you go through the personal statement that you do have kind of knowledge of the setting that you're applying for, without going into this, kind of almost like a lecture about the setting. Tell us, what links it, how is your experience relevant, how are your skills transferable to the setting, and kind of finish up with, what you might be able to contribute to the service. Try and understand the service that you're applying for, and where you see yourself in it, and that, I think that makes a very appealing personal statement, but also break it up into paragraphs and make it visually easy for us to read through.
Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you wanted to add?
I guess sometimes it's sometimes with things like transferable skills, I think it could be a hard one to get right, because we're not going to have all the skills. Some will be learned on the job as such, but you always will have something that you can carry over. But we want these transferable skills to be within a professional context, things that you've learned maybe in other settings, even if it's working in a telephone call center and how you relate to the people you talk to, or something like that. You have to kind of make it professional. We do get a lot of people assuming that personal experiences are always transferable skills, and they're not. They do help. They can help. So if people have had experiences of mental health difficulties and they've been in a service or something like that, or relatives had it, that's helpful to know, and it does help. It certainly brings a personal touch to the application, which is always welcome. But we need some more kind of transferable skills that are professional. So kind of what will you be able to do when you start in the service, and what do you need to work on? So I think just be cautious around emphasizing too much personal experience in applications, and focus more on or try and balance it out more with the professional experience as well.
I think previously when we've spoken, you've mentioned about supervision and talking about supervised practice experience and so on. Is there anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, so do kind of emphasize some learning as well that you've done, for example, in supervision, and I guess how that's improved your professional work, or where, kind of how it's contributed to who you are now as a practitioner. That helps us understand as well, where you're at as a professional. Not everybody's had a lot of supervisory input, but but do still try and include it, because it does help us show that you can be reflective. You can think about yourself and your practice, or the setting you worked in, for example. Which just demonstrates to us that you've thought through what you're doing, and kind of why you're applying for the role.
Anything else?
No, I think it's I think my main advice is understand the role you're applying for. Yeah, make sure that gap between the skills you have or the experience you have and the role you're applying for isn't too wide, and work on your personal statement, and work on making it clear and structured, and always link back to the person spec and the job description that you're applying for, so that we can understand what you're bringing to the role.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Thank you.
So I'm hoping that that has been really helpful for you to look at and to hear Patrick's perspective on shortlisting and the applications that he's received. I wonder if we could move on to the next slide, please. So let's bring everything together that we've considered for this evening so far when you're applying for a job. So firstly, think about the application as a whole. Have you shown why you want this role for this organisation right now in your career? Have you researched the role adequately and spoken to the person advertising the post to find out what they're looking for? Have you shown how you meet the requirements of the role based on the person specification and the job description? Have you comprehensively completed all elements of the application form? As Patrick pointed out, if you're using a standard template that you change bits on in order to apply for different jobs, have you made sure that you've changed the right bits so that it makes it clear what you're applying for right now? Have you got the balance right? Have you provided only relevant information and presented it concisely? Have you wasted words unnecessarily telling the shortlister all about the role that they've advertised, rather than demonstrating your understanding of the role? Have you proofread your application, or better still, ask someone else to proofread it and checked that it makes sense? Don't say that you can produce really excellent written information and then submit a form with lots of mistakes in it. This may seem simple, but in our experience, so many people are making simple mistakes. So shall we move on to think about some questions that you might have or some points that you want to make? Do write them in the chat. Did you learn anything new from seeing this? I hope so. What have you learned from listening to our shortlisters and from thinking about this together? Did you learn anything, Anna and Lara? I remember, Anna, you were saying that you didn't know straight away that, for example, application forms were scored.
Yes, I didn't know this until a little while ago, that literally it's by points, like how many points do you get per criteria almost. So I think that really emphasised to me to make sure that actually every single essential criteria that was on the person specification I had written in my supporting statement somewhere, just so that it was covered really. I have had a few questions come through. Do you want me to read them out to you, Maggie?
Yeah, please.
Somebody has asked, if you've already submitted an application, can you withdraw it and resubmit it if you found a mistake or some of your details have changed?
So I would suggest that if that's the case, you contact the HR department of the trust and check that out with them. I'm not sure whether that's a really good question, actually. I'm not sure if you can withdraw it and then resubmit. I don't know if you know, Anna and Lara.
I've done this many times. I have submitted an application and thought, oh no, I forgot to include this, or I put down my old phone number or something. If the application is still open for everybody to apply, then yes, you can I've always done it, so I'd resubmit a new application and then I withdrew my old one. just in case it closed in those 30 seconds between. So you can, if it's still open. I think once it's closed, at that point you can still contact the HR to change your contact details, but I don't think you can change the content of your application per se.
Yeah, I found the same. I was just going to add on to that because I think I submitted an application and the deadline had already gone, and I'd made it was a minor error on, I think it was an entry in the job section. I got the wrong date or something like that. I asked if I could change it, but because it's anonymized, they said that I wasn't able to do that. But because it was a minor error, it didn't actually have any impact. So I think it definitely depends at which point you're wanting to change it.
We've got another question which is asking, how and when do you apply for a role or a course?
I saw that question, Denise. That's a really interesting question. I wonder if you're able to come onto the microphone and just clarify a little bit and let us know what you mean by that question. Are you there, Denise? Did you want to clarify your question?
I think if we wanted to take it quite broadly, I guess the how, is NHS jobs is a good starting point to find the job applications that are open. If we're looking at that question quite broadly, rather than looking at a specific role or a specific course, then lots of them get advertised on NHS jobs. I think that's the same with a lot of the trainee posts as well, also get advertised on there.
Yes, you're right. And also some charities advertise on Indeed, don't they?
Yes.
As well. The other thing that I was thinking about this evening was about making that jump into your first role and how you go about doing that, because I think that's a question that comes up quite a lot. How do I make that jump into my first role? And I think for a number of people that happens in kind of small jumps, doesn't it? You start with one role and then you get to then you take another role that's a bit closer to where you want to get to. So, for example, when I first started, I started in a volunteering role as in a therapeutic community where I had to live in the community, and it was working with people with learning disabilities and mental health problems. And then from there, I stepped into a paid role. But I think a number of people go by succession to get into roles.
We've got another question that says, I've seen that for some training roles, you can't be currently studying elsewhere. If you're due to finish your degree in the same month that role would start, do you think that would be okay?
Let me just think it through. Yes, I think so. If you're, well, I think it depends, because sometimes for a role you need to have passed your degree. So even if your teaching has finished, you'll need to wait until you get your qualification before you can move into a role. But some roles may consider you before you have got your results. So I think it depends on the role, would be my advice. But ring up and speak to the people and find out.
Another one, if there are qualities that are not highlighted in the job specification, but you think are really relevant to the role, do you still include them, or do you always just stick to the job specification?
I think that's a really good question. I would include them. If you think they're relevant, include them. But the most important thing is to show how you've met the job specification. But don't feel that you can't talk about things that you think are really relevant. And actually, it would be really helpful to know why you think they're relevant. So we're always looking out for things like that. That's an excellent question.
Next one is, what can we ask the person if we bring them up apart from what is in the advert?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess if I was ringing up, I might ask, what does the job look like on a day-to-day basis? Lara, you had some on your slides, didn't you?
Yes, I was just thinking about that. It was when I was talking about how there was a lot of bullet points around the day-to-day, because it can be quite difficult to visualize it. And certainly in my experience, when I've called, I've definitely been interested to find out, well, what actually does this role look like day to day? What kind of activities will I be doing? Tell me a bit more about the hours and the service itself. And maybe the opportunities going forward as well. So it just gives you another opportunity to really get an idea of the detail of that role and what it might look like. And I think as well, it also helps if you've spoken to somebody and asked those additional questions. When you go back to the application form, I think it helps to just add a bit more detail and really put it into perspective what's actually required. But here's my slide on experience day to day and the bullet points here.
You can also ring and ask to speak to someone who's actually in the role, so that then you can find out a bit more about it. You don't have to just speak to the person who is advertising the role. You can say, can I speak to someone who's doing it?
That's what I did for this role as well, actually. I spoke to the person that was moving on from it, and I know that I asked a lot of questions around it as well, and they were very happy to answer those, and it was really, really helpful to do so. I think it can be a little bit daunting because you think, oh, what shall I ask when I phone, or I'm not really sure, but actually it's definitely worth the phone call. And I think Jessie did talk about that as well in the recording.
I think just to add on to what both of you have said, is I think it's also have a think about why you're calling them to start with. Like, what is it that's making you want to call them? Because I often don't call if I don't have any extra questions. But if there's something to you that's really important about a job role that you'd like to know before you apply, that's when I think it's important to make a phone call rather than making a phone call for phone call's sake. So, for example, if for you it's really important that you're working in a multidisciplinary team and that hasn't been specified in the job specification, then I would call up and ask, what's the team like? Who might I be working with? What other professions are there? So I think just thinking about what's actually important for you and why it is you want to call them. Lara, I know you're on time check. Do we have time for a few more questions?
Yeah, we've got time for a few more.
Okay, so as someone that is graduating this year with very limited experience, I always struggle to beef up my applications. How do I get across the skills that I do have and express my intention to develop more?
I think that is a good question, and I think it's a struggle that many people have. I suppose one of the things I would advise you to do is to really think about a particular role. So think about that role when you're applying for it. What are they actually really looking for? Have a conversation with them if you can, to find out what they're really looking for, and to really think about what you've got that will really bring them something in their service. What can you contribute to their service? I guess the other thing, I'm thinking about what Patrick said about don't try to make a jump that's too big, because you can't get shortlisted if the jump is too big. Try to think about how you can move a little bit closer to the role. So, for example, can you get a role that's a bit closer and then do some more additional work around it? Can you take on a bit of voluntary work that will give you some more skills and experience so that it can be beefed up? You might have to take several steps to get to where you want to get to, but you will get there eventually. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Anna and Lara.
I think the thing I'd say to consider is if you've done some studying, you can include skills that you've learnt there and use them as transferable skills. So, for example, if the job specification saying that you need to be good at working in teams, and actually in your university degree or any degree that you've done lots of group work, then I would use that as an example, because that's quite a transferable skill and you're showing that you've already started learning and developing that skill.
I think as well, sorry, Maggie.
No, go on.
I was going to say, just to add to that, at the beginning, it's always really difficult when you just haven't quite built up the skills and the experience yet. But even just that process of going through the application and applying for that role, And then if you're not successful, getting feedback around the areas that you need to develop is still really helpful, because then you can really pinpoint actually what are the skills that I do need to build on and how can I get that experience in the future as well. And it also to say that it definitely does get easier over time as you kind of build up the skills tower, as I call it. And then you can, yeah, over time it does make it a lot easier. I think in terms of time.
Oh, I was just going to say that I'm aware that sometimes we're not looking for a great deal more. So it could be that if you just add a few things on, exactly as Lara says, it will start to build your skills over time.
I was just going to mention the time actually. At the beginning, we were thinking of going to extend the session a little bit longer, and we have got a few more questions in the chat. Are we wanting to finish at past, or are we going to stay and answer some more questions?
Shall we do one more question?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is saying it's been really informative. I wonder what the organisers' views are on older qualifications, 2006, and people who have worked in the wider system, so commissioning, public sector, etc., returning to therapeutic work.
I think it's great. As Jessie said in her film, what we need is people with diverse skills and abilities. And I think just the fact that you've worked in different places and had different experiences really brings a lot to the workplace. So I think that it's a really good thing to do. And there are more and more opportunities to return to therapeutic work now. So certainly, I think it's a great idea. Shall we move to our last slide?
Yes, I think I just need to reshare because I think the control was taken away. I'm not quite sure how, but never mind, I'll just reload us.
Just to note that everybody's put your questions in, because there's still lots more questions. We are going to take a note of them and we'll answer them and get them written out answers and send them out to everybody who's attended today. So your questions are still going to get answered, just not right now.
That's a great point. Thank you. Excellent. Are we going to put this in the chat? The link to the survey. So please do fill in the survey. Just take a few moments now to fill it in. And let us know what you think so that we can work out what we need to do differently next time. And then we'll think together about what the next session will be about in June. So it's just a very quick survey. I'm glad you liked it, Serena. Thank you. Okay, shall we just think together about the next session, which would be on Tuesday, the 27th of June at 6:30. And we're going to be thinking together about interview opportunities. So following on from today, that's what we'll be thinking about. So do sign up and we look forward to seeing you then. Do become a member of the PPN. It's entirely free. It's really quick and easy to join. So do join us. Lara and Anna, is there anything that you wanted to say before we say good night?
No, I think we've covered everything, and we had lots of interesting questions, and we still got a few more that we'll answer as well and upload when we finalise the recording. And thank you everyone for attending and asking lots of questions.
Thank you very much.
I'm just going to put our email address in our chat box now. So if you've got any other questions that have popped up or you've got any queries, then please just email us and we'll get back to you quite quickly.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Anna and Lara, as well, for your help this evening. Thank you.